Let me just print this out here. So Jim, I think we were going to start off with I'm going to introduce you and then basically ask how you got involved in this.
Okay.
And then Jeff and I have questions. Most of my questions are about the bullet, we talked
Most of
about.
my questions are not about the bullets. So.
Okay. Okay.
So yeah, Larry, why don't you introduce Jim and get us going?
Okay. So listeners and readers of JFK Facts podcasts know that the last couple of weeks have been very full of information about Paul Landis's book, this former Secret Service agent who said he found a bullet in the limousine that President Kennedy was riding in after he was assassinated. And most of the interviews with Paul have been 30-second, 60-second interviews, but we are Jeff and I are really excited today to have Jim Robenalt be available for a detailed interview about this book. Jim is a corporate litigator at Thompson Hine, one of the leading law firms in the country. And as a litigator, Jim is very used to digging up facts and interviewing witnesses and trying to assess their credibility. So he comes from this is an area that's right in his strength. Jim was a consultant and the confidant of Paul when Paul was writing the book. And Jim is also a book author. And one of his books, a really good book, is Watergate, January 1973, which is of great interest to Jeff. So we're really excited to have Jim with us, and I guess we'll get to it. So Jim, why don't you tell us how you got involved in Paul Landis's book?
Okay, great, Larry. It's nice to see you in person. We've talked a couple of times, and I appreciate you doing this taped interview. And Jeff, it's nice to meet you too. I've watched some of your work and think you do good stuff. So thanks for having me. So first of all, a couple of disclaimers since I'm a lawyer. I'm speaking for myself and not for Paul. So don't take anything I say as gospel from him, but I have spent a lot of time with him. Secondly, I think it's important to say up front, since I've seen stuff about this, I had nothing to do with this book. Paul wrote it. It was sent to me in March, done. It was a galleys that I was asked by the publisher to do a blurb for the book because the publisher is Chicago Review Press. They had published my last two books. I have 4 books I've written, mostly on the presidency. They published January 1973 and then Ballots and Bullets, which is my fourth book. So I had nothing to do with the book. It was done. And I read it. I got it from the publisher, as I say, in March. I didn't go looking for it. It came and found me. But it was, it showed up and they said, you have to sign a non-disclosure agreement to read it. And I thought, what could possibly be, needed for non-disclosure at this point? So I read it and read it fast. I'll tell you a couple of things about the book because it won't publish until the 10th of October. I don't know why publishers do this where they have advance so far in advance, but they do. But first of all, it's a very charming book. It's beautifully written. It's about, his relationship with Jackie Kennedy and Clint Hill and all of that. It really is beautifully done. And then you get to Dallas and, the nightmare begins. And then you get to Parkland and he gives this great revelation. So I read it in one day. It was well done. He worked with a woman here in Cleveland who's a PhD who helped him put it together. She would come to his house on Saturdays. He would dictate to her. She would write it up, bring it back. But it really is his book. It's not, she didn't ghostwrite it. She just helped him. And she was great. She's very smart and did a beautiful job with it. So, you get to the point where I read this and I'm reading it and I read the whole thing and the bullet was found on the back seat. And I have to tell you, for the longest time, I thought Jackie was like sitting on it. I didn't realize it was on the top of the ledge originally. But I read it and I called the publisher and I said, boy, Paul, who I had met 6 years earlier, is in for a world of, storm here. This is, why didn't he come forward? Is this even possible given the evidence that we know? And surprisingly, this publisher didn't really do a lot about that. They were going to publish his book and let it stand as is, what he knew, what he saw. And the book ends not with him saying, I think this is what happened. So you're left with, well, what did happen? How is this possible? And I said, I would be happy to help him. I'd met him 6 years earlier here in Cleveland. He happens to live in the same town I do, Shaker Heights. And in 2016, the Jackie movie came out with Natalie Portman. My wife, longtime film review critic for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and she'd been asked by her editor to seek out Paul and have him go with us to watch the movie and then get his reaction to it. So we did. We went with he and his wife, and then we had a beer afterwards. And he's just delightful. He is a nice guy. Little did I know, he was in the midst of already deciding he was writing this book at that point. But just delightful, a really humble guy, very soft-spoken, has a great memory, is in great shape. His memory is better than mine at 88. I'm 67. I wish I had his memory. And he works out every day, gets up at 5 a.m, works out for an hour, golfs every week with his buddies. I went out with him. He can golf and, hit a tee shot, and he'll lean over and pick up the tee like he's 18 years old. I mean, he really is in remarkably good shape, but he's very soft-spoken, and he's not very glib. I mean, he thinks through what he says, and he doesn't feel real comfortable with public speaking. So in any event, I said I'd be glad to help him out. And so we started a journey probably in early May, where he started coming down to my office, and we'd spend 2 hours together, piece by piece, going over everything. And I did a ton of reading because I'm not like you guys are. I'm not a researcher. I know Bert Griffin, who's here in town also, who's on the staff, and did a program with him, Howard Willens, back at the 50th anniversary. So I knew those guys, and I know Max Holland. I know various people, but I'm not deep at all like you guys are, or most people listening to this. So I did a lot of reading, and it's probably good that I didn't know a lot, because I just brought my own. If what's Paul saying is true, what does it mean about all this? And so I ended up, figuring out that, boy, because I was a huge skeptic when I started, huge skeptic. Like, I don't think this is possible. Once I met him and we had spent enough time, I knew he was not lying. I knew that he had it together. I knew that this was not a recovered memory or anything shady like that. It just, he knew about it, and he didn't come forward because he was worried that people were going to say he did something wrong. I think from the very beginning, he was worried about that. He denies that and says it wasn't until later that it kind of occurred to him that might happen. But in any event, I went from a huge skeptic to this is plausible. And that's about as much as I can say, because as I say, I'm not that deep into it. I'm pretty deep into it now with all this, but his theory is plausible. And frankly, it's very consistent with what Josiah Thompson wrote in 6 seconds. Yeah. And it's interesting because that's the book that Paul started to read when he got to page 146, where he said the bullet was on Conley's stretcher. He's like, no, that's the bullet I brought in. This is wrong. Who do I tell? Who do I talk to? So he then, when he wrote the book, he didn't read anything else. He didn't even finish that book. He wanted to just write it purely from his memory and not be influenced by stuff. So I went from huge critic to this is plausible. And that's why I said to Paul and the publisher, I should write an extended piece on this to go along with Peter Baker's piece in the New York Times to explain why it is possible. And I wrote it very carefully. I didn't say, I believe this firmly, or this is exactly the way it had to have happened. I just said, this seems to me to be plausible. And then these are the questions that it raises. So that's my long answer for you, Larry, but that's how I got here.
So as a historian, Jim, how do you deal with, Paul's told several different stories over time. People say, well, if you change your story, why should we trust you? How do you think about that that's a real problem in his account, that he's
Yeah.
given several different accounts. How do
Yeah.
you think about that, and how did you think about that when you were reading his manuscript?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't know anything about his prior accounts when I read the manuscript, but then clearly we sat down and talked through all of these things, his statements, what is written in the Kennedy detail book, and various other things. And it's pretty interesting if you read it all and understand his mindset and what was going on. There are reasons for these inconsistencies that I think are understandable. I'll start off by saying that all of those agents in their statements say things that contradict themselves even from one day to the next. They were in an extreme condition when they wrote those things. They were all writing the week after, days after the assassination. Paul in particular had PTSD. I mean, he couldn't stop the loop in his head of Kennedy's head exploding. He was 15 feet away, and it really was severe. Plus, they weren't sleeping. They continued to work. Paul, I can document for you like 4 days in a row where he barely got even an hour's sleep, totally sleep deprived, PTSD. And if you look at various of these other agents, their statements, they contradict themselves one to the other. And several, like Sam Kinney, he's clarified what he was saying in those statements in 1978 with a very long affidavit that he gave to the House Select Committee, that somebody could look at it and say, well, that's not what he said in these statements. But if you read the statements, you can say, oh, I see how this maybe is consistent. But the fact of the matter is, I challenge anybody to be in that extreme condition and write perfect reports. Right. So that's that first, set of reports and all of that. I will tell you that it's my view that when Paul was writing those reports, I think he was somewhat worried already about what he had done. But he says, no, that's not true, that he'd simply, everything was a tornado at the time, and that he just didn't even, his first report doesn't even talk about Parkland. So there are different views on that. My own is that I think he was already a little concerned, although he did say that he expected to be interviewed by the Warren Commission. So I think in that sense, all of them thought, I'm going to do my best. They were really, I mean, think about the conditions they were writing under. And I think they all thought they were going to be interviewed, including Sam Kinney, who was never interviewed. He's the best witness of them all. He's driving the car. He can't turn his head sideways like the other guys are doing, like Paul's doing and Clint Hill, and they're all looking around. He's got to keep his focus and not hit the car in front of him. He sees Kennedy get shot, then he sees Conley get shot, and then he sees the final shot. And he's very clear about that in his affidavit. It's not as clear the way he wrote his original pieces. But again, you got to give those guys a break. Clint Hill himself said he didn't hear the second shot, but today says there were 3 shots. So, I mean, it's just, there are inconsistencies I think are understandable. Once you get to like 2010 with the Kennedy detail, where he says he sees a bullet fragment on top of the thing, again, you have to understand the context. He had just been asked to help out on that project by Jerry Blaine. And the only reason he agreed to do it, because he had avoided so much. He was, always asked by people, always said no. He really wanted to get away from it. He really didn't read a lot of stuff. If anything, he certainly didn't read the Warren report. But if you read what is in there, he's asked by Lisa McCubbin, who is the woman who ultimately married Clint Hill, to help out with the public, with adding some stuff to the book. He literally agrees like the day before the manuscript is due. So he begins to deal with her. This is before he knew of her relationship with Clint. It might have even been before that relationship started. But the reason he was doing it was Clint. He didn't know who she was. And she was literally writing him from the Middle East, where she and her husband and kids were located. She had met Jerry Blaine, and Jerry Blaine asked her to write. She is a very talented writer, and I think wrote that entire book, along with the ones that came out with Clint. But he didn't know that at the time. He didn't know who she was. He started to talk with her about this and was going to say something about it, and then backed off. And so I think what she wrote in that book, and I can't find that she ever ran it past him to say, is this right? I think they were moving very fast because the manuscript was due, and it was telephone calls, and she may have misunderstood him. I don't know for sure, but I do know what's important is he says he picks up that fragment and then puts it back down. He doesn't disturb a crime scene. And I think that he's still not willing to come forward with the full facts at that point. He didn't know whether he could trust her. He really didn't know her. And I think that's how that ended up there. But we looked very closely at this, and there's no evidence to me that she ran that past him. He may have said the bullet and she misunderstood it. But my guess is that Paul was just not ready to come forward at that point, and didn't know whether to trust her or not. And he still wasn't coming forward with the other agents at that point. So I think I think he really was in a state at that point, 50 years later, of, I just don't know that I really want to tell people about this. So there are explanations for the different things that have been said in his original statements, and then what's been written later that I think are understandable. But to go back to your question, Jeff, when I first read it, I didn't even know what his statement said, and so once I saw the statements, all right, let's sit down and figure this out.
Right. Larry, you have some questions about some of the details in the statement?
Yeah, but first, Jim, I'm friendly with Burt Griffin. I actually have an autographed copy of his recent book. Have you talked to him about this book at all?
Yeah, as soon as I got this stuff, and I was under, an obligation not to disclose, I asked Paul for permission to talk with Burt, and because I knew, and his book was coming out, it was too late for him to do anything in his book. So I sat down with him for a whole morning and said, Burt, this is what he's saying. And, I was in the midst of saying, I'm not sure whether I could vouch for it or not. I'm working on this. Burt had, in passing, met Paul. He liked him. Burt didn't want to, Burt, it's just a class act from start to finish.
Yes.
And I actually read and helped him with some of his early drafts of his book, because he struggled to write that book. It took him a decade to write the book, and it came out so nice by comparison to where it was. I can see now the single bullet theory is wrong, but that wasn't his thing. That was Arlen Specter, So anyway, we talked about it, and then he's faithful. He's a judge. He's a friend, and he didn't tell anybody else, to my knowledge. And so his book is out now. I've got it. I've read it, and it just he really shaped it up and did a good job. I think he's added a ton to the literature in the sense of how this was all a political environment that needed to be really understood. And he just does a great job with that. I mean,
From his judicial temperament, do you think that he was receptive to?
No. he was like, oh, I feel sorry for Paul, that sort of thing. And he wasn't really willing to open up his mind and say, well, what if, just think about it. He's been in defending the Warren Commission for 60 years. And I don't blame him. He hadn't read the book. I just told him what it was and what it said. And then we were going to sit down and kind of debate the pros and cons, and we didn't get to that point. And I hope we'll do it sometime here soon. But he's been defending this since way back when, and ably defending it. He's a very smart guy, and he's a really wonderful guy who's a great judge here, public servant. He started in doing welfare in the inner city, and he's everything you'd want from a good public servant lawyer.
I've invited him to speak at a couple conferences, and it didn't work out, but I really have a lot of respect for him. Yeah. So on the bullet, I guess the first question is, you said Paul was reading Ting Thompson's book, and when he got to the section of the book where they talk about the CE 399, the magic bullet,
right?
And he said it was the wrong gurney. But do you have any feeling about the way the bullet looked from the bullet that's in evidence?
Oh, he said it was the one he picked up. he said it was the one he picked up. He clearly, when he picked it up, I mean, the thing to know about Paul is from the time he was a kid, his dad was a hunter and a sportsman, a good friend of Woody Hayes's. So he knew Woody growing up. But he was a hunter. And one of the reasons I have to be on interviews with him is he can't hear very well because he did so much shooting in his youth. And then as, over time, he's still a gun aficionado. And so, he cannot hear very well. So I have to help him out with that. But he knew when he saw the bullet that the striations on it meant it had been fired. And he recognizes the bullet. That's the one that he brought in with him. And he knew what it was when he picked it up.
Because the two guys that handled the bullet, O.P. Wright and I forgot the other one.
Tomlinson.
It was
Daryl Tomlinson.
Yeah, right. They said
Yeah.
it was more pointy than the one that was in evidence, but Paul says that the one in evidence is the one that he saw.
Yeah, absolutely. And I that exhibit, I think it's I forget what it is, like 1024 or something like that, where the FBI guy went back to ask them later, kind of squirrely answers about, I don't know that I recognize this, and I thought it was point. I think Daryl Tomlinson found it on the stretcher, gave it to O.P. Wright, who gave it to Dick Johnson, a Secret Service agent, as they were leaving to go out to Love Field. And Dick put it in his pocket, brought it back. Strangely enough, I think I said this in the Vanity Fair article, he was assigned by the group to go back and sit with Jackie Kennedy in the casket. And so there you have the casket, the bullet, and the widow, all within close proximity, flying back to Washington. And then he brings it back, gives it to James Rowley, the head of the Secret Service, who gives it to an FBI guy who then takes it over to Frazier, who's the head of the lab. And it's Q1. It's the first evidence in the assassination.
Yeah.
Q meaning question. They don't know where, it's not, they don't know how it fits in, but that's
so when I first heard this story, I went, wow, this is really eerily similar to the story that Gary Luke told right before the 50th anniversary. Gary Luke was a neighbor of Sam Kinney. He claims that Sam Kinney told him that when they were taking out the president's body, Sam Kinney had seen a bullet in the front of the limo, and he's the one that took it and then put it on a stretcher. And after I did like a soft cross on Gary, and then I listened to Sam Kinney because he was dead by this time, and it just didn't add up. So it didn't seem to make sense. And then we have two other accounts. Nurse Bell said she saw a bullet
near his head,
by his president's head. And then Dr. Young, who worked for Dr. Berkeley, said that when I think it was Humes or Boswell, one of them asked, they wanted to reconstruct a skull, and they asked him to get some agents to go back and get their fragments that were in the limo when the limo was in the White House basement or parking garage. And Dr. Young said that when they went there, they got 3 skull fragments. They also found a bent bullet, and that this was given to, put in an envelope and then given to, I think, Boswell, and it, the bullet disappeared. Do you know whether Paul was aware of any of these accounts?
No. And I'll tell you, Kinney, I don't think that I wouldn't put any credit to that. He did a very extensive affidavit in 1978. So there was plenty of time for him to say something like that, and he didn't. And I can tell you that the inspection of the limo is a great commission exhibit. I can't remember the number of it, but it is exactly what happened. Greer drove it back out to, it was somebody else, I think another agent, drove it back out to Love Field, and they put it on a C-124 and flew it back. And then took it to what's called the White House garage, which is not at the White House. It's like at M and something at the time. And they bring it in, by that time they put the bubble top on it and so forth. They bring it into that garage, put it in a corner, and Greer, I'm pretty sure it's Greer, goes and tells Rowley that he saw a skull piece in the back of the car. So Rowley authorized him and some other people to go back and enter the limo. And this is like 10 o'clock at night. and they went back. And to me, there are a couple tells about this. Number one, the top was still on. It's in a garage. It's November. It's dark. And they open up the back seat and they do find, they say, a skull, a piece of a skull. They also went into the front seats and with their hands, and this tells me that they didn't have lights on, and why they weren't documenting this with photographs is unbelievable. With their hands, they felt around in the front seat, and right next to where Greer had been sitting was a fragment. And then on the floor where Roy Kellerman had been sitting was a fragment. And those are marked as commission exhibits 5, whatever, those 2 fragments. They're fairly significant fragments. And they brought those back. So you'll see on the list, those are like Q2 and 3 or whatever, those fragments. But the skull piece, I believe, was taken to the autopsy and delivered to the autopsy. And there's a lot about 3 pieces. The way I read this, there was only 1 piece that they recovered. They also put their hand along the back of the limousine where Kennedy and Jackie had been sitting to get some brain matter to take back to Bethesda. That's right where Paul saw 2 bullet fragments that he said were like the size of his little finger and mushroom shaped. And it could have been that they accidentally took those bullet fragments with them when they did that inspection. And then it was later that night at 1:30 where Frazier with a group of FBI guys go in and they start taking these pictures, including that. But they take the top off. Right. It's not dark like that first inspection. So I think everything that people could do wrong, they did wrong in those 24 hours after the assassination.
It really is remarkable for law enforcement officials to be so sloppy with a crime scene. It's just remarkable.
Yeah. And just not even documented, take pictures. And even the ones they took were terrible, that night. They're not very clear. There are not enough of them. They're not details. It just is. It was really, I guess it's the old saying, nobody expects a president to be assassinated, and people just act stupid. But there was a lot of stupid acting all around.
You said something very interesting in our last conversation about what they were focusing on during the motorcade about the handguns.
No, it's what Paul will say is that all previous presidential assassinations have been with handguns. And when they were scanning, especially as they got down into Houston Elm, they were scanning the crowd. They weren't looking up, which they should have been. And there was really lax rules about allowing windows to be open in windows and all that stuff, or in buildings, tall buildings. But it wasn't in their mind that a tall building would do this. So Paul, for example, was scanning to see if a hand was coming out. And that's what they did at like the airport and all that sort of stuff. They are scanning for, people who look deranged or fast movements of hands, because it was handguns that had gotten all previous presidents, not a rifle.
So one of the, some of our listeners have, another question they've asked is that in his earlier statements, he said that he stayed outside the ER, but in his book now, he says that he went in and put the bullet on the stretcher.
Mm-hmm.
Were you able to vet that out a little bit, or?
No, I think that is the same issue, with those statements. They just were written so fast. And, if you look, his first statement says they only heard 2 shots.
Right.
And then the second one clearly says there were 3 shots. There's a first shot, and then the second one he calls the next shot. And then he says there's a third shot, which he calls a second shot. So he clearly identifies 3 shots in that statement. But I'm telling you, he was wrecked at that point. And to say that he was getting things wrong and, later thought about it and all the rest of that stuff is, I think, entirely understandable.
And then,
Jim, that some of the like Nurse Hall's statements, do you corroborate Paul's story, or is there evidence you see that corroborates his story?
Nurse Hall could. I saw her piece before everybody's now tying that to Paul's piece, in the media. So I saw that and I thought, that she may have seen the bullet on the stretcher. So that could be corroborating. It's interesting. Paul also said that the president was brought in on a gurney and then moved over to a cart. Conley said the same thing about himself, that they were moved from the gurney onto the emergency room cart. All the doctors and nurses said, oh, no, they stayed on the same gurney that they came in. But Paul clearly saw that transfer. There's another doctor in the last year who's come forward who was down there. He was a young guy at the time. I forget his name, Gottlieb or something like that. But he says that the president was moved on. He helped move him. So those sorts of corroboration and so forth are out there. But I mean, the bottom line is that I think the corroborating evidence of Paul is Sibbert and O'Neill's autopsy report, that it was a shallow wound in the back, that it did not transit the president. And they didn't think it did. And there was no evidence that it did. And so I think that's the most corroborating thing, because once you know that, then it is likely that as Kennedy is blasted back, he clearly bounces off violently off the back, and it could have dislodged it. But there's also, if you look closely at that moment, Jackie's got her hand right back there where it would have been. And she clearly is reacting to the final shot. And I think most likely accidentally dislodged it onto her clothing, where she then immediately turns upward, right where she stretches way out, right where it would have been on her clothing is right where Paul found it. So I think it's that physical evidence that corroborates what he's saying more than anything else.
So did he find it? So you're saying he when he found it, it was on the left rear of the seat, or was it closer to the center or to the right? Was he that specific?
Can I share screen? I can show you exactly.
Yeah, Alex, why don't you?
I believe. Let me. I may have to make you a host real quick.
I think you might have to. Yeah.
Let me do that.
And then I've got a PowerPoint that has, but I'll show you exactly.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
You'll have to share that with Bert.
I'm the host now. Oh, good.
Take it away.
Yeah. So let me just pull this PowerPoint up, because I'll show you exactly where it is, Larry. It really took me multiple sessions with Paul to have my own eyes opened up, that I read it so fast. I thought, how did it get into the seat underneath?
Because I suspect that Clint was probably on top of it, but not realizing it, maybe when he was stretched out.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So let's see. All right, so now I've got the PowerPoint up in front of me. Now let me come back to you guys and share screen. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah, you're starting to share. Yep.
Okay. So this actually has some really cool photos. I put this together because we're going to be doing talks. But that's obviously the book. This is Paul coming out of the Capitol the morning. Paul worked for Mark Shaw after the assassination, who took all these iconic photos. There's a really cool story about that, but these are all Mark Shaw. There's his dad, who knew Woody Hayes. A guy in his hometown, Bob Foster, became a Secret Service agent and encouraged Paul. And then he's the one who you see holding little Caroline's hand as they go into Arlington in that one photo. This is a great photo. This is John, and this is when Paul's on the Kennedy detail and he falls down and Paul leans over, picks him up. Look at the look on his face. And then this is just, this is him too. I mean, he is that catches his personality. And of course he was with her and all that stuff. So anyway, I got a lot of that stuff, but let me show you, Larry, exactly where first of all, this is kind of interesting. I wanted to show Paul where this photograph was taken. This is the Alt-Gens or Alt-Gen. Yes. I don't know. Alt-Gen, Jim Alt, the AP photographer. This is the most important of all the assassination photos, in my view, because Kennedy's been shot. You can see him with his arms up, and she's got her white glove. You can see it here a little more closely. Conley,
his left arm, yeah.
Yeah, and Conley's already been shot. And so the people who've studied this link it up to this frame 255. And you can see her hand right there. You can see Conley's head sideways. there. His shoulder has now come down. Both of them been hit, but it's interesting that Clint Hill had not yet jumped off at that point. And he no doubt was just about to, but that's kind of an interesting look. Conley's face is like right under Jackie's. You can kind of see that in this whole thing. So this is the warning here. There's her hand on the back. You see where it is?
Yep.
I mean, and you can see that it also, if you watch it, it's like, and so here she is leaning out and Clint Hill getting on top of it. Exactly what you're talking about. This is my favorite of the photographs. It's kind of bad to say favorite, but this is them on the way to Parkland. So this is literally coming screaming around the corner. So this is 40 seconds after the assassination. Looming in the background is the book depository.
Right.
Oswald is still in that building. That's an incredible photo to me. But Paul's got the sunglasses on there. That's what he's doing. So, so if we look at, so this is where he found it right there.
Okay.
At the top of the seat. And he sees these little things here. I mean, there's brains and stuff here. He sees those as maybe the two fragments that he had seen there. I don't know if you can see it very closely there, but
yeah, there's a little thing there.
Right, I'm circling it.
That might be brain tissue, but because he said it was in blood.
Yeah.
You know,
he said it was in a pool of blood, and he picked it up and looked at it and so forth. And so that's where he found it. I think I've got a couple other. This, at the top of that right there, you can see the blood pattern where Jackie was going up to grab, goes right up to where he found it.
Yeah, you can see right at the top there. There's that staining there where the head hit the top.
Yeah. And where she also carried, blood with her when she went and went over the whole thing. So
yeah, I think that falling out of her clothes is probably the most logical, because if the bullet had enough energy to just fly out of his back, it would probably not stay on top of the seat, right? But if it's coming from her, it's falling down.
I agree, but I don't know. But I agree.
The New York Times article, Peter Baker's article, said that Paul had at least one conversation with Clint Hill, and Clint Hill supposedly said in an email, not that he wasn't saying that Paul was wrong. He was saying that Paul should not write the book because of the quote unquote ramifications.
Yeah.
Which I thought was an interesting, if you really think the man's wrong, you say, look, that's not, I didn't see a bullet. I was right there. Ramifications. Do you have any insight into that conversation or those?
Yeah, we talked about that a lot, because the first thing I said, well, you figured this out. What did you do? And he immediately called Clint, and Clint was with Lisa McCubbin in Europe doing one of their. So this is 2014, promoting one of their books, and Clint writes back and says, don't tell anybody else. Big ramifications. Let's talk. And so they then talked a couple of weeks later, and Paul told him, all of this. And Clint said to him, that seems like maybe, but they both were aware that at that point, the Secret Service was under intense scrutiny because of the Obama hookers and somebody running into the White House and all that stuff. And they're both like loyalists to the Secret Service, like Marines, Semper Fi, and they were like, do you really want to? Because the big ramifications is both for Paul, which Clint, was concerned about, and just, the big ramifications for the Secret Service, somebody not coming forward all these years. You want to think about it. And so Paul did think about it, but he then, it just kept churning that he really needed to do something about this. And so he had met Lou Merletti, who was the former director of the Secret Service, because Lou came to Cleveland when Al Lerner bought the Browns and brought him here, and he was the director of security. Paul met him. It's a long story about how they met, but they were going to lunch regularly. And then Lou decided to retire and move to Florida. And Paul thought it's kind of now or never. And so at the last day of 2015, he went to a Starbucks with him and said, here's what happened. And Lou said, you got to get this out like yesterday, you know. So where Clint was kind of a stop sign, think about it. Lou was like a green light, from a director, former director. And that's in the book. He wrote this in the book that he told Lou this. He didn't write about Clint. Those guys are very protective of each other. And so
until this past month.
until this past month. And what Paul told Merletti is exactly what he told Clint. And then Merletti sent him to a guy who was the dean of Duquesne at the time, who is a guy I happen to know through John Dean. I'd met him in 2013. He's now the president of Duquesne. And that's where Cyril Wecht has his center, by the way. But his name is Ken Gormley, and he's a great scholar. He had me write the Harding chapter in a book called The Presidents and the Constitution, which is really a great book.
On William Harding?
No, on Warren Harding.
Oh, Warren Harding, right, the president. Right,
and each president has a different writer, a scholar who writes about them. So Ken I knew, but Lou Merletti knew him too, because Ken is the author of the biography of Archibald Cox, which is why John Dean knew about him. He's a beautiful historian, does great work, very meticulous and careful. Paul sent by Merletti to him because Merletti met Ken Gormley when he was writing his Monica Lewinsky book, because Merletti was the head of the Secret Service then. And he sent him there to say, help him find an agent, kind of thing, because he knew he was somebody who published books and things like that. So he went to meet Ken, and he told Ken the exact same story that he told Clint, which is, I found it there, I left it on the president's stretcher. Not I found it there and left it on a stretcher in the hall. He didn't say that. And Clint is just misremembering that at this point. But those two other guys have confirmed that Paul told him the same thing that he had told Clint back at the time. So I think he's just misremembering that. I confirmed with both of them as part of my due diligence that Paul had spoken to them and told them exactly what he says.
Now, Paul also says consistently that he initially thought the shot came from the front. I think it was on Jake Tapper or maybe Jesse Walter, but it looked like he started equivocating a little bit, maybe because of the pressure he's getting, but saying that, well, he was close to the overpass. Maybe he heard an echo.
Did you? No, we talked about that. And the third shot is one that I try to stay away from because as I tell you guys, I'm not that deep to be able to say whether it came from the front. I kind of find Tink Thompson to be the best writer about all this stuff. And, he's got a theory now about two shots at once, which could be true. But we talked about that a bunch, and it's pretty clear to me that when Paul wrote this book, he didn't look at anything else. And he kind of just, when he wrote the book, he doesn't know how that bullet got back there or how to explain it. And I think he was still kind of thinking that Oswald shot 3 times and hit 3 different times. And that's how this all worked. But as he's now seen, because he and I have spent so much time talking through this stuff, things like the FBI autopsy report that he had never seen before, he's now starting to question, well, maybe I did hear it from the front. I think he fell in line with everybody else about, I must not have heard it from the front. It must have been an echo.
Right.
But he's now kind of like open to thinking about a lot of different things that he'd never thought before and never had reason to think before, but now he is. I think thinking about it.
Jeff, I got 2 questions, but why don't you take something, and then before we go to Watergate,
No, I was gonna ask Watergate, sort of bigger picture, historical. So if you want to do more of the forensic type questions, we can do that. But that's what I wanted to ask Jim about.
Okay, let me just some of our listeners have also asked that, did Paul take an alcoholic drink that night or not? Because says one thing, he had a Coke, and then the other time he said he had some special drink. I forgot the name of it. And not that it matters, but that's another one of those little quirks that.
Yeah, no, I spent some time on that. First of all, it is very clear these guys got in at like 12:30 at Fort Worth, 12:30 Eastern time, 11:30 Central. So when Paul says he's staying out till 5, he's still got his watch on Eastern time. It's 4 Central, but it's still, and they, as you know about that day, they'd gotten up in Washington and flown down and barnstormed everywhere. And these guys, they traditionally take like peanuts with them in a bag because they don't have a chance to eat and all that sort of stuff. So by the time they get to Fort Worth, they had 2 major motorcades flying around, and they're shorthanded too. I mean, it's ridiculous how few people were protective. So they were starving. It was not unusual to get a drink, even though the policy was thou shalt not do that, to just wind down from the day. So they were told by Merriman Smith, you know who he is, that famous guy. I think he won the Pulitzer for his description of that day that he wrote. He was an interesting guy, but he said, well, the Fort Worth Press Club has, an open bar and we'll have food, complimentary things for people coming in with the president. By the time they get there, it's like 1:00, their time, maybe 12:00 or 12:30. But they go over there and Paul gets a scotch and soda for sure. And then a couple other people get some stuff, and some of them go back and some of them are still hungry because the food was gone by that point. And so they go to this beatnik place called the Cellar, which is, you can't make up these places, but they go there and they get these fruit drinks that may or may not have had alcohol. Paul tells me he does not believe he got 2 of these drinks that had alcohol in it. And if you see the photos of him the next day, he's not hungover and he's perfectly fine, perfectly reactive. He's also 28 years old,
Right.
but that's,
there, but we won't discuss it.
yeah. But, I don't think he was drinking like Everclear whiskey or anything like that. I mean, and remember, this was his first motorcade. This was with the president, with that party. He had been with Jackie and traveled around with Clinton.
This was his first motorcade.
This was his first presidential motorcade. Yep. So, and they put he and Clint on the follow-up car because Jackie was in the limo. And so he's still angry that the 2 political guys got in the middle seats. Kenny O'Donnell and Dave Powers. Yeah. And he thought they took the places of other people, like that one guy who waves at him as they leave Love Field. But and they kind of pushed him roughly aside too, like, we're going into this. He just, to this day, he still kind of grumbles about that. But that's the case. So
on the my last question really is the process of Paul writing his 2 reports. Do you know, or does he remember how he was asked to write those? And was there any instructions, any editorial work done before the final was issued? Did he simply dictate it and then gave it in and that was it? Or was he told, just curious how those started? Is the product that's in the record actually his writing, or did someone edit it?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I did ask those questions. First of all, the first report was just to the Secret Service, and it's on official stationery. It doesn't even talk about Parkland. They were all asked what happened in Dealey Placid. They were really interested in where the shots came from and all that sort of stuff. So that was the focus of that one. The second one was the day after Johnson announced the Warren Commission. And so I think they were kind of told to do a little more elaborate that they would give to the Warren Commission, but they all believed they would be interviewed. So I think that was the second one. And what's interesting is I asked the same question about, did you dictate? Did you have secretary? He laughed. He said, no, we had an office in the White House and we sat down and did our own typing. And it was the same because the second report is done up in Hyannisport.
Yeah, it's November 30th. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, this whirlwind that they're in, they having had almost no sleep 2 days after the funeral that was so emotional and so traumatic. He and Clint fly up with Mrs. Kennedy and the kids to see Joe Kennedy and Rose for the first time. Rose had come down for the funeral, but Joe for the first time. And they get up there and it's Thanksgiving. It's just horrific. And then on Friday, again, after staying up very late, getting up very early on Friday, that's the night that what's his name comes to do the interview. That is the subject of that Jackie movie.
Is that Manchester, Jeff, or
not Manchester? The other guy who wrote The Making of the President.
oh, White.
Yes, Theodore White.
Betty White, yeah.
Yeah, Theodore White shows up at like 8:30 that night and then stays till 2 a.m. And then they're up the next morning at 7. And that's when he writes his second report, types it out up there in a typewriter that they have up there. So again, it was just these extraordinary, extreme circumstances. And if you want to see something really cool, Theodore White's notes from that interview with Jackie are in the National Archives has them, and then his typed up memo of it. And what it shows you, I think, is very much what that movie was trying to get at. It's like, it's insanity. It's like this period of time where irrationality was, I tell people that 6 seconds is ours. It's like somebody turned on an insane switch in our politics and has not turned it off yet.
Yeah.
But it was just the interview, the things she's talking about, her free flowing. She repeats very specifically graphic detail of the skull and all the rest of that stuff that she told the Warren Commission she couldn't remember. It's in those notes. She was repeating it over and over to everybody about what had happened. And,
no, but your understanding is that once he typed it up and sent it off, nobody said, hey, you got to redo this, or you got to
No, it went to the chief. Nobody even talked to him about it. Nobody interviewed him from the Secret Service. Nobody interviewed him from the FBI, and nobody interviewed him from the Warren Commission. And they didn't talk to each other about it. They were so humiliated and devastated by what had happened. They didn't talk about it. They just talked about what they had to do, which was a lot. You think about that state funeral with the 300 of the world's most important leaders walking in the street the day after Oswald is killed, walking in the street. It's just, and these guys are like, there's like 40 of them to protect. Of course, they had other people, but it's just, it's an incredible burden that they were under psychologically, and the fact that they didn't immediately relieve those guys of duty and get them help explains a lot.
So, Jim, I'd like to step back a little bit and look at this. This is very lawyerly. What we're doing is examining the evidence. Let's step back and put on your historian's hat.
Okay.
January 1973, your book is about, a pivotal moment in American history, end of the Vietnam War, Roe versus Wade, and the beginning of when the Watergate scandal really starts to explode. So I want to ask you about where the JFK story kind of resonates in the Watergate story. And that's what Bob Haldeman's claim, that when Nixon is heard talking about the Bay of Pigs, the whole Bay of Pigs thing on the White House tapes, that's a kind of coded reference to JFK's assassination. Yes. And in my book on the CIA and Watergate, I think I confirm that, because we can hear Nixon on a tape when he's talking to Dick Helms about his desire for this secret Bay of Pigs material. And Helms is like, why do you need this? And Nixon finally blurts out the "Who Shot John" angle. And to me, that is proof that when Nixon was talking about these Bay of Pigs things, he had the Kennedy assassination in his mind. Yeah. Did you think about that, or kind of look up, how did you think about that story that Haldeman told as part of the Watergate tale?
Yeah, Larry and I talked about this briefly, but the first reference to the Bay of Pigs thing is on June 23rd, 1973. It's the week after the break-in, and John and I did a 3-hour seminar on that tape, which becomes known as the smoking gun tape that takes Nixon down when it finally comes out. But we have John's notes and Haldeman's notes from that whole thing, where Mitchell had suggested to John that the way to shut down the FBI investigation of Watergate was to tell the CIA to go to the FBI and say, stay out of this, because there's too much CIA involvement in all this. They had helped Howard Hunt out, and Howard Hunt was part of the Cubans and the Bay of Pigs and all the rest of that stuff. And those 4 guys who went up and were the Cuban Americans who were arrested in the White House. So they had what was known as a delimitation agreement between the FBI and the CIA that they wouldn't get into each other's business. And so that was kind of cooked up as, well, this is a great idea. This is how we can kind of shut things down. And John tells that to Haldeman, and Haldeman takes down the notes. And they're very detailed. And when we did our seminars, we went through every one of the notes to look at it. Haldeman goes in and talks to Nixon and says, you can hear it on the tape. John Dean talked to Mitchell, and they came up with this idea of the delimitation agreement. They would have somebody from the CIA go tell the FBI to stand down. And that's where Nixon blurts out, because it's going to open up all these Bay of Pigs things. And, the CIA was humiliated during the Bay of Pigs because, they'd given advice, and then Kennedy, of course, backs off at the last minute. It's a complicated story, but it's a sore point for the CIA. Whether that was a reference to the assassination is something, Jeff, that I haven't studied. I've seen it, and I'll be glad to read your book and give you my thoughts on it. But it's clear that Nixon had an obsession with Kennedy because, for example, Howard Hunt's safe that was in the White House, in the executive office building, the plumbers, the safe that he had. In that safe were 2 or 3 faked State Department cables, essentially implicating JFK in the assassination of DM, that they had faked. And, they were, Nixon had his guy go up at Chappaquiddick, Tony Ulasewicz is his name. Right. There was an obsession there. And so it could very well be that Nixon believed the CIA was involved in the assassination of JFK. So I'll be interested to see what you have to say about it.
And I know when you and John were at my old law firm, that was what I was focused on, which is why I didn't recognize you. And I had asked John, I said, hey, what about Haldeman's book? And where he says this in his book. And John said that, Haldeman subsequently
corrected the record or whatever.
Corrected the record, that was his writer that wrote that. It was without his approval.
Which was true, by the way, because I interviewed Haldeman's editor, and Haldeman told that story one time when somebody was bugging him and saying, oh, are you a JFK conspiracy theorist? And Haldeman said, oh, that was just my writer. So my friend who was his editor at Times Books, I asked him about that. And he said, the notion that there was one word in that book that Bob Haldeman didn't approve is complete insanity. The man was a perfectionist. He read it 5 times, and every word in it reflected his beliefs. So, it's just that story that he told because he didn't want to get involved in it wasn't true at all. And the book did reflect his thinking.
Yeah, and that most of his daily notes eventually were dictated, and the tapes are available to listen to. And I don't know if that part of the book was one of his notations or just an editorial note in the book.
Right.
I'll tell you another really interesting connection, and there are a ton of them, is when Bobby Kennedy wanted to find out who was really behind this. And of course, the legend is that he said to the CIA guy, what's his name?
McCone.
McCone, yeah. Did your guys do this? But the guy that Bobby Kennedy sent over to the Warren Commission, and this is in Howard Willen's book too, but John told me this and Charlie told me this, was Charlie Schaffer, who had helped Bobby Kennedy get Hoffa, and he was sent over simply to find out for Bobby what had happened. And he was with them for almost six months.
Really?
Yeah. He later becomes John Dean's lawyer in Watergate. And great guy. I met him in one of our programs in Washington. Real gentleman, really smart, former, U.S. attorney. And he and John just played triple chess on the White House during that time when they were doing all this stuff. But I wanted to find out from him what he knew, and he would never tell me. you know, what his conclusion was about who had done it or what, you know, any of that sort of stuff.
Wow.
And unfortunately he's gone, but he was a great guy, and he and John were a super team together and remained friends his whole life.
Mhm. Well, that leads to the natural next question, you know, even stepping back farther from Watergate. What do you think about November 22nd, now that you've educated yourself and talked to one very close witness? You know, do we have a good explanation of Kennedy's assassination, or do we not? What do you think?
I try to be very careful about this because, as I say, I'm real deep in some things and really shallow in other things. But I think the thing that turned my head to you guys was really reading Silbert and O'Neill's stuff. Not only their report, but also, you know, the time they talked with Arlen Specter, and that got suppressed too. He knew what they were saying. You know, there was a March 64 interview, but their affidavits in 1978, 77, 78 are very, very specific. And those many years later, and then they gave depositions where they said, you know, no way was this a single bullet theory. You know, they just, both of them, it was too low in the back to begin with, but that's not what happened that night. And once I read that and read the Warren Commission report saying that further investigation during the autopsy that night disclosed the bullet path going through, I thought that is a complete and total lie, and was made up after they found out about the tracheotomy, you know, wound. So once I read all that, Jeff, I think I went from pretty much believing the Warren Commission to something was going on here that was causing Arlen Specter in particular to make this out to be something because they wanted it to be a lone assassin. And once I kind of accept that that's the case, then I'm open to trying to look at other evidence anew and try to, you know, judge it and think about it all. Yeah. So that's kind of my overall impression, that I'm now much more open to there probably were multiple shooters, much more open to there could have been a front shot or a couple of front shots, and that there was, you know, I mean, the House committee said there was a conspiracy. So I'm much more open to it, but I want to be careful because, as I say, just not deep enough, especially in the last shot and the mechanics and, you know, what we know from the x-rays and photographs and all the rest of that stuff.
Jim, there's been like 7 mock trials by law schools and bar associations, 1967, the first one's at Yale.
Yeah.
We have the ABA one in 1992. I participated in one at the South Texas College of Law in 2017. 6 of the, now obviously these are not real trials, and then, right, but 6 of the 7 mock trials have resulted in either an acquittal or a conviction. Because the only one that resulted in a conviction, I'm sorry, acquittal or a hung jury. 6 of 7. The only one that resulted in a conviction was the televised one in '86 with Vincent Bugliosi and Jerry Spence was doing his usual stuff.
Yeah.
If you were to put, so as a experienced litigator, would you put Paul Landis up as a defense witness?
I would put him up as a recipient witness, someone who knows facts that need to be considered in the overall story. I wouldn't say offense or offense, defense or offense.
But you would find him credible enough.
Yes.
Use him as a recipient witness. Okay.
Very much. He's very credible. He, you know, early on I was saying, well, if your theory is correct, and he goes, it's not a theory. I mean, he's very consistent. And he's, you know, I really do believe he's telling the truth. And, you know, as lawyers, we always got to be careful about not vouching for witnesses and stuff like that. But I would vouch for him. I really would.
Well, wow, I think that's great, Jim. Any more questions, Larry?
I think we got, you know, there were a lot of questions, sub questions, but, you know, I'm not going to go into details about the gurney go up and then how could the bullet, there are questions about what happened in the ER. I think Jim covered all the big issues. And, you know, the book's coming out next month. I just urge people, before you, you know, reach a decision, read the book first. And I believe Jim, you and Paul are going to be speaking at the Wex Institute, right?
Yep, we're in November. We're going to
Do
be
you have
there.
any other, with your PowerPoint, do you have any other places you'll be speaking?
Well, he works at this historical society in Cleveland,
Oh.
which used to be called the Western Reserve Historical Society, which, by the way, is where I got my Harding love letters, the copy of them there. It's
Really?
just, these stories are so interconnected. It's crazy. It really is crazy. But he's going to be speaking there on like November 10th, and we're going to be doing a conversation between us about all this stuff.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And showing some of those slides that I showed you
Yeah.
to illustrate.
So we have November 10th, and when are you guys speaking at WEC? Is it the 17th?
I think it's the 15th. I think it's the 15th.
15th. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Just
But
want listeners who are in the area, if they want to listen to Paul, where's the place again in Cleveland?
Western Reserve Historical Society. It's on the campus of Case Western Reserve. And it's now called the Cleveland History Center, I think is the formal name of it.
All right. That's it for me, Jeff. I think this was
well,
really...
Jim, thank you for your time. I'll be speaking at the WEC conference as well, so maybe we'll meet in person there.
Good, and exchange books. I'd love to see some of your stuff and read it. That'd be
good. I'm going to have a book for you to autograph as well. And I have Tink Thompson's original 6 Seconds in Dallas. I took it from my school library when I was
see, people do come forward years later.
They do come forward to admit wrongdoing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly
and I brought it to the mock trial to have Tink sign it. I was afraid it was going to say, return this to the library.
Yeah. By the way, the fun thing about January 73, one of the stories is Roe v. Wade, which obviously became huge news. I interviewed and met a guy who was Justice Powell's law clerk in writing that book, because he came to a Watergate seminar we did in Phoenix. Larry Hammond was his name. He's now gone, but I'm the only guy that ever interviewed him. He's the guy that came up with the viability standard. So my book really tells that important history from a direct witness in all this. And again, it was this Watergate connection, because when Larry left the Supreme Court after serving with Justice Powell for two terms, he went over to the Watergate Special Prosecution Force to help them out on some stuff. So he came to one of our seminars, and Barry Goldwater Jr. was there, and we had a great time. But that's how I ended up being able to write that book with some authority.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this. We are so appreciative. I mean, this is the only thing that Paul's out there on 30-second and 60-second. You can tell he has a little problems hearing too.
Yes.
And he comes across hesitant, and we're just so grateful to you to tell us the backstory and help fill in some of the facts.
Well, you guys may be the only people I talk to, Larry, because once you sent me something and showed me that you were the head of ABA stuff, I knew you were legit. And I watched some of Jeff's stuff. I know he's legit, but there's a lot of kooky people out there that I don't really want to deal with. So
yeah, good idea.
All right, good. Andy, nice, or Alex, nice to meet you.
Thanks a million. Jim, we will let you know when we post this. We'll
okay.
A heads up and send a link. So
that sounds great.
Thanks so much for your time.
Nice to meet you both.
Okay. Have a good week. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Take care.